Good evening and welcome to Alan's Italy. For the past couple of years it's been a year and a half now that we've actually started doing this. And I've taken you all over Florence. I've taken you to piazzas and churches and a lot of museums, some well-known museums, some lesser-known museums. And I was discussing this with someone recently who indicated to me that they said, Alan, have you seen every museum there is to see in Florence? And I said, well, yeah, just about every museum. And I mentioned a couple that I haven't seen. And then I was kind of thinking about it, and I realized that there is a museum, a rather prominent museum, that I've never really spoken about on the show. And that's what tonight's show is going to be about. Actually, the intent of the show was originally going to be the Boboli Gardens, which is one of the most famous gardens in the world, certainly in Italy, and the prominent museum, a garden in Florence. And part of the intrigue of the Boboli Gardens is the palace for which it is really the backyard for, and that is the Palazzo Pitti. So tonight's show is going to be a study of the Palazzo Pitti and the Boboli Gardens, and there is the first shot of it, and it's spectacular. This is a view from about halfway up the hill that goes up to the very top of the Boboli Gardens, looking back at the Palazzo Pitti, and this is what we're going to be focusing on tonight. Now, these are the museums that I have mentioned on the show. And, I made a list of them, and that's, quite a few museums. And those are the ones I've actually been to, not the ones that, I haven't been to. And I was going through that list a couple of days ago, and I said, gee, I have not done the Palazzo Pitti. So tonight that's going to be the show. There are some of the ones you may remember, some of them from previous shows. And this is the Palazzo Pitti. And it was intended to be the largest palazzo in Florence in the 15th century. And the palazzo is named after Luca Pitti. I have some pictures here that I'd like to show you, which will actually shed light on the entire situation. This is a map of Florence, the center of Florence, and the Palazzo Pitti is right over here. As you cross the Ponte Vecchio, which is that beautiful bridge, which we'll look at in a few moments, and go down this street right here, the Via Guicciardini, you come to the Palazzo Pitti right over here on the left side as you do that. So that's how you would get there from the center of Florence. This is a view of the Arno River, and the right side is the part of the river that everybody knows about, and most of the sites are located. But one of the really charming areas of Florence is the left side of that picture, which shows you what's called the Oltrarno district. And this is a view of Florence from above, from the Piazzale Michelangelo, looking towards the northwest, and you could see the Palazzo Vecchio almost in the center, and off to the right you could see the cathedral with Giotto's Campanile, and off slightly to the lower left rather, you see the Ponte Vecchio, and the Palazzo Pitti is really not in this photograph, but certainly if you cross the Palazzo Vecchio, it's right over here along that side. I'll hone in on that in a moment. This is actually one of the other bridges in Italy, and you could see that there's a building right up here. This is the vicinity of where the Palazzo Pitti is located. This area right here is the Fortress Belvedere, which is the that's right behind it. But the Palazzo Pitti is like kind of back here. To get there, you would have to go across the Ponte Vecchio. I mean, there are many ways of getting there, but one of the best ways is to go across the Ponte Vecchio. This is heading on the Ponte Vecchio going towards the south. You can see all the jewelry stores on the left and right. The Manelli Tower over there on the left side that we spoke about when we were doing the tower show a few weeks ago. And when you come to this side of the Ponte Vecchio and continue going right past this piazza, that's a very, very nice little restaurant over there on the left that I've eaten in, but not for a number of years. And you continue walking down this street, which is the Via Guicciardini, you eventually come to the Palazzo Pitti. And the Palazzo Pitti was started by Luca Pitti, who was a banker in the Medici empire of banks in the 15th century. He worked for Cosimo il Vecchio, who was the first Medici to get involved in banking, and he did extremely well. And in the year 1458, Pitti decided that he wanted to build a palazzo bigger than the Medicis. And let me show you a picture of him. This is the best picture I could get, and it's really an awful picture, but this is, being really not a very major figure in Florence. This is the best picture that there is of him. This is what Luca Pitti probably looked like. It's a poor photograph, of course, because it's also a very poor original of him. But he was born at the very, very end of the 14th century and lived in those days what would be considered a very long life. And he wanted to build a bigger palazzo than his benefactor, who was this fellow, Cosimo il Vecchio, who was arguably the wealthiest person in the world at that time. And when Cosimo il Vecchio passed away, Luca's fortunes came into bad disarray, and he wound up losing a lot of money. Now, originally in 1458, he approached the most famous architect in all of Florence at that time, namely Brunelleschi. And I actually do have a picture of Brunelleschi. There he is right there. And he said to Brunelleschi, "I will pay you a lot of money to build me a palazzo." And Brunelleschi said, no, I don't really have time, but my pupil, whose name was Luca Fancelli, said, well, I'll do it. So he did it, and of course, in 1464, Cosimo il Vecchio passed away. Luca suffered financial loss, and he died then in the year 1472, and then the house was kind of owned by, whatever was left was owned by his descendants, who eventually, in the year 1549, sold the house, or what was left of it, to the Medici family. So he wanted his house to be bigger than the Medicis, and yet he wound up selling it to, actually he sold it to Eleonora di Toledo, who was the wife of Cosimo I. Cosimo I is not a direct descendant of Cosimo il Vecchio. Cosimo il Vecchio had a son named Piero. Piero had a son who was the most famous of the Medicis, namely Lorenzo il Magnifico, who then had sons who went on to become a pope, namely Giovanni, who became Pope Leo X. But Cosimo I was on a different branch of the family, and he was very wealthy, and he was crowned the Archduke of Tuscany at that time, which is namely the mid-16th century. And he hired the most famous architect and painter and actually art historian of his day, namely Giorgio Vasari, to enlarge the palazzo and also create what is now known as the Vasari corridor. And we'll talk about that in a moment. This is an overhead shot of what the Palazzo Pitti actually looks like now. And in case you're wondering where it is, here it is right here. So here's the Ponte Vecchio. You come across this is a great, I love these overhead shots because it really gives you a chance to see what Florence looks like from above. You cross the Ponte Vecchio, you go down the Via Guicciardini, and you come to this very huge piazza, and right on the piazza is the Palazzo Pitti. Now, one of the things I tried to do was to get a picture or some sort of a reconstruction of what the Palazzo Pitti looked like when it was first built, because it was smaller. I believe if you could see the pointer that I'm showing now, the original palazzo was maybe this wide, and then it was expanded significantly, and it was also expanded going outward towards the back. So this is now the current Palazzo Pitti, which is really still a very, very large palazzo. And you could see that in the back are these beautiful gardens, which we'll get a much closer look at later. This is the Boboli Gardens. So this is the Palazzo Pitti. These are the Boboli Gardens. This is the Forte di Belvedere, which was a fort that was constructed later. And this whole complex is a really wonderful, wonderful way of spending a day in Florence. And, you know, as I'm going to show you in a few minutes, there's so much to do in this area that you could very easily spend an entire day here. This is what I consider to be a fascinating picture, and it sort of shows you a little of what the original palazzo kind of looked like. This is the original right here in the middle, and there was this wing over here. This is not actually the original palazzo, but very, very close to what the original must have looked like, because now, of course, it has those two wings on the left and the right. But this is what the Palazzo Pitti looked like probably in the 16th century, and this is what the Boboli Gardens kind of looked like at that time. And there's the Fortress Belvedere over there on the upper left-hand side. So this is a really fascinating picture of what that looked like then. This is what it looks like now. You know, when you get into the gardens, you come upon this huge map, and the map. We took this picture of the map right off the sign, and you could see what it just looks, what the whole complex looks like. Here's the Palazzo Pitti, and there's the Pitti Palace right there. The Boboli Gardens extends all the way around into this area. Now, I've been all over this. In fact, when I was there in 1992, the first thing my ex-wife and daughter and I did, for some reason, well, I'll tell you what the reason is in a moment. Instead of going straight this way, which is a tremendously steep climb, which we'll see in a few moments, we headed this way, which was more flat, and it was a very hot day, and we walked along this line of trees all the way to the very end here. When I went with Laura in 2012, we actually came out of the back here, and we went straight up to the very top, and then we came down in this direction. So between those two visits to the Palazzo Pitti, I actually got a chance to see most of the Boboli Gardens. I was in the Palazzo Pitti alone, examining the museums in the early 2000s, which I'll talk about a little later. And I've never actually been to the Fortress Belvedere. And this is what the Palazzo now looks like as you approach it. And it has exhibitions, as you could see, the banners listed in the front. But it's a huge palazzo, but I'm told not the largest in Florence, because the largest is actually the Palazzo Medici and Riccardi. I love this picture. I took it off the internet, so we didn't take this picture. But this is a distant picture of the Palazzo Pitti, as taken probably from the other side of the river at a very high up point. And this gives you a view of what the palazzo looked like with the gardens behind it. and all the buildings in front of it. It dominates that part of the Ultra Arno district of Florence. And this is a 19th century view of it. And this is the piazza. The piazza is large. It's this is just one portion of it. And across from on the other side of the piazza are cafes and leather stores and other kinds of stores. I know that there's a stationery store over there as well. But for the most part, you know, this is a great place to have a little aperitif or a little lunch. You know, you come out of the museum, you have some lunch, then you go to the gardens afterwards, because the whole thing is really quite exhausting. So that's what people do over there. This is a view from the other side, looking towards the north, and you could see over there in the background the tower of the Palazzo Vecchio. So this is like probably about probably a quarter of a mile from this spot is, you know, and this is where the Ponte Vecchio is located. And there's the cafes over there on the left. And these are some of the buildings that surround the Palazzo Pitti. And one of the things Vasari did at the behest of Cosimo I, who was his patron, was to create a passageway that the Medicis can take. Now, the Uffizi was the offices of the Medici, and they lived in the Palazzo Pitti, some of them at least. Now, when they wanted to go from their residence to their offices, they didn't really want to hobnob with the populace. So what they did was they asked Vasari to create a corridor for them, which would go from the Uffizi, and this is the very, you know, end of the Uffizi, where it overlooks the river. You get great views from these windows up here of the river and the Ultra Arno. But he was asked to create a corridor which would go through these buildings, across the bridge, and into the residence known as the Palazzo Pitti. And this was that Vasari corridor. Here's the corridor over here, coming out of the building, which was right next to the Uffizi, and this is what the corridor looks like. This is actually now a museum, and it is, ladies and gentlemen, the only museum in Florence I have never been to, although I have tried many, many times. It's just almost impossible to get entrance into this museum, although I've tried for the past, literally, 15 years. And I've had some really influential people trying to get me in, and they have not been able to. This is that wonderful picture, incidentally, taken from the window of the Uffizi. But this was what Cosimo told Vasari right off the bat. Create a corridor for us to walk across so that we could go across the bridge. And there it looks, you know, from a distance. And it goes through here, through some buildings, across the bridge, over to the Palazzo Pitti. And there it is, as it looks like it's coming. See, it doesn't come right from the Uffizi. It goes from the Uffizi through this building and then out this way and then across there. And right now, that museum houses mostly sculptures and paintings of famous Florentines. And back to the piazza, where people kind of, as you could see, relax on the piazza. And this is around to one side of it, looking kind of towards the south, and you can see there in the distance is the cathedral. And this is some of the detail of the palazzo. You can see how stunning it's how magnificent it looks, with the fountain there in the front and some of the statues around the side. This is the beginning of the steps that you take to get up to the actual museum part. And that's another look at the Palazzo Pitti from a different angle. And the first gallery, so here's what happened. The Medicis sold it in the year 1737 to the House of Lorraine, which was French nobility, who eventually turned it over to Napoleon when Napoleon was conquering Italy. and he lived there while he was in control of Italy. Eventually, it went to Victor Emmanuel II, who was the unifier of Italy. You know, Italy was all these city-states, and he unified it into a united country in the year 1871. He turned it over to his ancestors, who eventually, one of them was his great-grandson, Victor Emmanuel III, who gave it to the nation of Italy in the year 1919, where it turned into a series of museums with 140 rooms open to the public. And the most famous of all those museums is the famous Palatine Gallery. And the Palatine Gallery is the most interesting part of all the museums in the Pitti Palace. And it contains the art of Rubens and Perugino and Titian, Raphael, Caravaggio, Correggio, and it has a ceiling. You see that ceiling in this particular picture that was done by a famous painter by the name of Pietro di Cortona. And I will show you a little bit of what this gallery has to offer. It's way too extensive for me to really go into any great detail, but you know, this is what it looks like. It's beautiful. It's like, you know, there's the beautiful ceilings, and there's paintings all over. It's not like the Uffizi. It's not the Uffizi, where I would say maybe 90 to 95% of everything in the Uffizi is famous. And you know, you go into the Uffizi after studying a little about Italian art, and it gives you a chronological view of what art developed from the 13th century all the way up to the present. Chronologically, you know, starting with some of the early painters of the early Renaissance, carrying it all the way through to the Baroque era and beyond that even. This is not what you see in this museum. Everything is kind of scattered, but it's still very interesting. It has some major work, but mostly it has a lot of minor work. And that's another view of it. I took this off the internet, so of course it's a small image, but you can see how stunningly beautiful this museum is. You know, and you walk from room to room, studying as much art as you could possibly gather in, and there are literally hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of paintings. Another view of the museum as a whole, and that's actually a much better view of it. One of the rooms, many, many monumental paintings. And of course, the Pitti Palace is known as containing the art of one of the most famous artists of the Italian Renaissance, actually the High Renaissance, namely Raphael. And I've always been fascinated by Raphael. This is a self-portrait that he did. So this is exactly what he looked like. And he was, you know, a damn good painter. So, you know, if he knew what he looked like, it was certainly him. And that's what he looked like as a young painter. And as you could see, he lived a very short life. He only lived to the age of 37. And he was one of the great artists in the history of Italy and of the world. And he has many, many paintings in this gallery. Of course, this is also off the internet because they may restrict the photography of some of the art, and that's why we didn't take too many pictures. This is one of his most famous. This is Julius II. This is the famous Julius II that had such an adversarial relationship with Michelangelo. He wanted him to do the Sistine ceiling, and Michelangelo did not want to. And you know, the famous movie, The Agony and the Ecstasy, in which Julius is played by, I believe, Rex Harrison, and Michelangelo is played by Charlton Heston. And that's the famous Julius II, who also indeed commissioned Raphael to do his private apartments. This is another painting by Raphael, one of his masterpieces. And this is, of course, a very famous one. And as you could see, Raphael really knew how to do portraits. Yet another one. I think this is a member of the Medici family, but I'm not totally sure. But you could see that Raphael was indeed very, very talented. This is Perugino, who was an artist during the 15th century. And he has a very famous painting of, I think this is called the Lamentation, the iconography in Italian art. I think this is a lamentation, which is basically, Christ has been taken off the cross. He's, lies down, and then everybody kind of gathers around. Very, very sad, of course. So that's a Perugino. This is, if you don't recognize him, Caravaggio, and it's a self-portrait. Now, when I went on the internet, I found a lot of self-portraits of Caravaggio, and this is the one I decided to create because this showed him in the most animated and, maybe realistic and also a little tongue-in-cheek manner. This is what Caravaggio looked like, and this is one of his famous paintings in the Pitti Palace in the Palatine Gallery. And of course, this is what Caravaggio was known for, kind of dark colors with very, very realistic views of people. This is another one of his, which I think is called The Sleeping Cupid. So, by going to this museum, you get some really wonderful views of some of the famous paintings. These are some of the other paintings that I located that are in the Pitti galleries. Okay, so that was one of the galleries. Another gallery was the Costume Museum, and there's a story behind this because Laura and I had spent the day walking around the Boboli Gardens, and that was not an easy thing. We spent about 3 hours walking, and you'll see the terrain in just a few moments. It's really quite a hike walking around the Boboli Gardens. And then we decided to go to the Costume Museum. And we thought for some reason that the costumes in this museum were going to be contemporary costumes of the 15th century. I'm not sure what gave us that impression, but that's what we were aiming for. And what we wound up seeing were not that at all. We wound up seeing costumes and sculptures that were not from the 15th century, were from a later time. But it was still kind of interesting. Let me go back to this one, because this is what, as you walk up the steps to the costume gallery, this is what the hallway looks like below. But, it was kind of interesting, but these were not costumes of the 15th or the 16th century. So we were a little disappointed, but it's still very interesting. And there aren't too many people in these museums, so you really get a chance to study all the art very, very carefully and kind of in seclusion. And a lot of these dresses were actually 20th century dresses, so that was kind of disappointing. But a little interesting, but certainly not worth the, I would say, 100 steps that we actually climbed to get to this museum. Another museum is called the Argenti Museum, and the word for silver in Italian is argenti. And the Argenti Museum consists of 25 rooms. It's in the left wing of the Palazzo Pitti. It was added during the 1600s, and it has precious gems and cameos and semi-precious stones, ivory, silver, a lot of silver, and documents the sumptuous life of the Medicis during the time that they were the de facto rulers of Florence. And you see some really beautiful pieces. This is the wealthiest family, arguably, in the world at the time. They were the bankers who bankrolled some of the European kings in their wars against each other. And you get some very beautiful pieces. Let me make this larger again so you can see this piece. This is a very famous piece in the Argenti Museum. And that's another one as well. You could see how beautiful that was, but, you know, again, these people had, you know, the money to do this. There's another piece. All this is in the Argenti Museum. And then there is another museum. There are, you know, many, many museums. One, and this is another one, the Gallery of Modern Art. And the Gallery of Modern Art was created in 1924 on the second floor with 30 rooms, and it has art by Canova and Tenerani and Dupré, and it's, you know, it's a pretty museum. I personally, I can't relate to, you know, to this art, but it was kind of interesting. This is a better view of that particular part of the gallery. So, you know, you can see it's beautiful, and you can see it's also empty. So, you know, not too many people come here, but you do get some interesting pictures. And then, of course, you get a chance to go to yet another museum called the Royal Apartments. And the Royal Apartments are the actual apartments where the Medicis lived, and there's a lot of period pieces. So, you know, you go to a lot of museums around Florence, and they put pieces from around that time, but these are actually from this particular location. It's not just period pieces, it's actual pieces that were in situ. And this is what that looks like. These were some of the private areas of the Medicis. This I took off the internet. That's not my interpretation of that, with the, you know, that beautiful frame around it. And then, of course, there's a porcelain museum, and there's also a carriage museum, which I don't have in here because I wanted to move on then to the Boboli Gardens. And this is what the Boboli Gardens looks like as you come out of the back of the Palazzo Pitti. And that hill that you see straight ahead is a very, very steep hill. And the only way to get to the top is by going up large flights of steps. This is what it looks like as you get halfway up, looking back at the Palazzo Pitti from midway up to the very top of the Boboli Gardens. And this is a well-known fountain, and it is a fountain by, well, it's called the Fontana del Carciofo, which is of the artichokes, because one of the sculptures over here resembles an artichoke. Somebody's holding an artichoke, so they called it, it's actually a shell that the person's holding, but it was misconstrued to be an artichoke, and that is like a very beautiful fountain right in the center. And these are some of the things that you see as you know, just begin to exit the Palazzo Pitti from the very back of it, heading into the Boboli Gardens. And then what you see along the side are beautiful sculptures lining the various sides to the left and to the right. And this is a view as you're about to embark upon some of the steps to take you to the very top. And you can see that these are beautiful gardens. The Boboli Gardens get their name from a hill known as the Boboli Hill, which takes its name from the original owner of many of the houses in this region, a fellow by the name of Borgolini, who eventually sold it to Luca Pitti. And the gardens themselves are from the mid-16th century, and they're in the style of many European gardens. In fact, I read somewhere that there's a very strong similarity between the Boboli Gardens and the gardens of the Palace of Versailles, right outside of Paris. And I compared the two, didn't find much of a relationship similarity between them, so I didn't bother to show it because I was a little dubious of that claim. But there's a lot of stone and a lot of statuary and fountains and grottos and nymphs. It was originally laid out for Eleonora Toledo, who of course was the wife of Cosimo I, by a fellow by the name of Niccolo Tricolo, who then passed off the job to Amanati, who then passed off the job to Vasari. And there is no natural water source to water these magnificent lawns, so the water is actually piped in from the Arno, and the gardens themselves were expanded during the 17th century. This is just a bunch of views of what the Boboli Gardens looked like. And you could see that not only is it beautifully decorated and well-kept gardens, but it's also some beautiful statuary, and as you will see as we go along, fountains as well. There's a close-up of some of the statuary on the periphery as you enter. And now you're beginning to walk up, and those steps don't look very difficult, but for us it was a lot of huffing and puffing going up. Some more views of the statuary along the side. And there's different places you could go. There's steps that take you to all kinds of different areas. Florentines come here to spend a warm afternoon in the summer. It's a beautiful place, and under a nice tree with a lovely picnic lunch, this is really a great place to spend some time. There's one of the statues. We're getting higher up now, almost to the top, and you could see that that's quite a climb. And that's one of the famous fountains as you walk up. And you can see to get to the very top, you have to walk up those steps straight ahead in this particular picture. Some beautiful trees are planted throughout. And we're almost at the top now, I believe. Either at the top or almost at the top. And this is what it looks like as you look backwards at the Palazzo Pitti. And that's another view from a slightly different angle. And I remember being here in 1992 and just, holding back my daughter from jumping into that. I told a story once on the show of my daughter actually getting into one of the fountains in the Piazza Navona, the fountains of the Four Rivers. So this would have been a pretty cooling off spot. I think we're at the top now, away from the steps, looking back at where we had just been. And we're just about at the top right now. And of course, the reward of getting to the actual top of this is to look back and see this incredible view of most of the Boboli Gardens, the Palazzo Pitti, and then Florence behind it, and even behind Florence, going to the north, you could see a little view of the town of Fiesole. This is a little better view of it because you could see you could see more of Florence, and we're going to see some really beautiful views in a few minutes. Some more statues. This is me at the moment that I think I got to the very top of the hill, and I just leaned against that spot there, and I said, I am just totally exhausted. And Laura snapped that picture of me right there, which I thought was kind of interesting. And these are views from the very top looking down. You can see it's just a lovely, lovely spot to spend time, a relaxing afternoon in Florence. This was May, so it wasn't that hot, but in the middle of the summer, it can get very, very warm. And actually, the view we're looking at now are the hills to the very north, where the town of Fiesole is located. And then we headed in that direction, which was to the east. And we decided that rather than go back the way we came, we would kind of explore a little bit and go towards the east. And there was actually something that I was very interested in seeing, that we were headed in that direction. So we headed towards the east, and the reward there was that we wound up getting this magnificent view of Florence looking west. Originally, I thought this was the view looking towards the south, but it's really more towards the west. South, towards the northwest. Oh no, excuse me. I think I got that wrong. I think this is the dome of the Church of San Lorenzo. So forgive me, that is a mistake. This is a view looking towards the north. And that's the Church of San Lorenzo, the dome, and of course Fiesole in the distance. And this is the spot we were standing at. That's an observation tower over there. And now we're looking a little more to the north, slightly to the east, because you could see the cathedral over there on the right side. And we took a close-up of that observation deck over there, which we were not permitted entrance to. But right next to it, you could get a really magnificent view of Florence. And there's the dome of the cathedral, and there's the Campanile of Giotto over there on the left. And then further over to the left, of course, is the dome of the Church of San Lorenzo. And this is another view of Florence. This is the view of Florence looking more towards the west. This is the one I was confused about. We're looking more towards the northwest now. So right in the middle there is probably the Arno River. But really we're looking towards the west now, because I think that church steeple over there on the left side is the steeple of the very famous church of San Spirito. And as we walked around it, this is another view we got of looking at Florence. There's another view looking towards the west, northwest, and another view. And this is looking, I think, more towards the directly towards the north. Beautiful views from the top. Well worth the trip to the top of the Boboli Gardens. Okay, now we're on our way down, I believe. Yeah, we're on our way down now towards the spot that I'm going to be taking you to next, which is kind of interesting. Past, again, some beautiful views and some beautiful statues. Manicured gardens. We're heading that direction. Along that wall, we come to this spot. This is the spot that I was aiming for. And this is a very famous grotto. And I've done some reading about this grotto. It was created between the years 1583 and 1593 by an artist by the name of Buontalenti. And it's called the Buontalenti Garden. Buontalenti lived between 1531 and 1608. And I'm reading my notes here. This is the spot that I want to show you. This is what Bernardo Buontalenti looked like. And this grotto was created by him. And as you get very, very close to this really beautiful building, on the extreme, let's see now, as you come into the Palazzo Pitti, as you're coming into it, if you go to the extreme left, then go around, this is where it is. So coming down from the top of the Boboli Gardens, walking towards the right, this is what you see. And originally, there were beautiful Michelangelo sculptures. Now, these are what's called the prisoners. They're called prisoners because Michelangelo did not finish these sculptures. As you could see, this is in an unfinished state, and the figures within these sculptures are kind of prisoners within the rock. And for that reason, these are known as the prisoners, and these adorned the very four corners of that grotto that we just looked at. Eventually, these were put into the Galleria Academia, where Michelangelo's David is located. This is not a Michelangelo sculpture, but there were other sculptures now all over this area, on to the left and to the right. But right in the center is this, and this never ceases to gain the fascination of the visitors to this particular place. This is a statue which was based on a dwarf that Cosimo I had in his court. Now, dwarfs back in the 16th century were basically put to ridicule. They were made fun of because, they were small and people didn't know any better in those days. And, they were the source of jokes and ridicule. And Cosimo, though, had great respect for this particular person. His name is Braccio di Bartolo, who was the court dwarf, the court jester of Cosimo I. And Cosimo decided to name him Morgenta as a nickname, which was a twist on a 15th century epic by Luigi Pulci, who was writing about the famous giant Morgante, who was killed by the bite of a crab. And, as a play on words, he decided to name his dwarf Morgante, meaning giant. And he actually had a very, very strong liking for Braccio di Bartolo, because in Cosimo's will, he left Braccio a tremendous tract of land. So he did not consider him in ridicule in the very least bit. He considered him not only worthy of, bequeathing some of his land and giving him a tremendous amount of respect, but he also decided to place this figure in a very interesting figure. You could see that he's riding on top of a tortoise, and that tortoise is a symbol that Cosimo I used to kind of represent the family emblem. And you could see that his right hand is up and his left hand is kind of on his hip, patterning, and that's what he actually looked like, Braccio di Bartolo, also known as Morgante. There's no dates as to whether, as to what year he was born or died, and this is a painting that was done by the court painter of Cosimo I, Bronzino. And that's what he looks like from the side, patterned after the very famous statue of Marcus Aurelius. That this is actually a copy. The original is in a museum in Rome, but the copy of this statue of Marcus Aurelius that was found in the bottom of the Tiber hundreds of years ago and was originally placed, the original was placed on the Campidoglio in Rome, and now this is a copy. But if you'll look back, do I have a picture of that? No, I got to go back a little bit. Notice this picture of what Morgante looked like, and then look at this picture. And Cosimo I actually did this purposely because he wanted to create a relationship among himself as the ruler of Tuscany, Marcus Aurelius as the emperor of Rome, and Morgante as this mythical giant. And so that was all purposeful and very, very interesting. And this is, if I had a little more time, I would have done one of those things where I put them both side by side. So, this is what he looked like, and this is what Marcus Aurelius looked like. And let's, now continue. We're coming now down to the very bottom of the Boboli Gardens, getting back into the Palazzo Pitti. We then come to the Fort Belvedere, which is the third part of that whole complex of the Boboli Gardens, the Pitti Palace, and the third part that you could look at is the Fort Belvedere. And the Fort Belvedere was created a little later on Do I have any information on that? And I don't really have information on the Forte Belvedere. I thought I did, but apparently I don't. I know that this was created later, and that's a view of it up there. This is the Fortress Belvedere, and this is a better view of it right over there. And we actually walked along the walls. Well, here's some information. It was created by Fernando the First de' Medici between 1549 and 1601, so obviously the fort was created within that period of time in the very late 16th century. And I think that Buontalente, again, was the architect of that fortress. And these are some views of what the fort looks like. This is off the internet. Another view of the walls off the internet. And as I said, we didn't go to this, so we don't really have some really great photos of this, but it's a very interesting fortress. And by the time you finish walking in the Boboli Gardens, you're completely exhausted. And that's what some of the ramparts and towers look like connected to the fort. This is a picture we took on the way down. Another view of the fortress. And back to the very top of the Boboli Gardens. Actually, I wanted to talk a little bit about my trip to Italy coming up in a couple of weeks. We'll do that next week. So, next week, though, we're going to be talking about the gardens of Italy, and in that regard, I will talk about some of my favorite gardens, mostly the ones located in the north of Italy on Lake Como and Lake Maggiore. And that was tonight's show. Thank you very much for watching. It was a pleasure bringing it to you, and I hope you tune in next week. And for now, buonanotte e buona fortuna.